You able to see that, Ayman?
Good to go.
Good to go. All right. Well, I thought I'd start out a little differently today and put up this picture, which, boy, that's an archetype of a picture of a scientist, isn't it? An old-timey scientist. And I rather doubt anyone in the audience might know, but I'll ask, does anybody know who that is? If you know, type it in the chat box. We'll give you a prize if you know who that is. And I'll give you a little bit of a hint. It's not going to be much of one, but here is a picture from a movie about this scientist. So if you happen to know who that is, I see some guesses. Nope, it's not Fritz Haber. Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? But in fact, that is Dr. Paul Ehrlich. And there was a movie about him that starred Edward G. Robinson. In fact, he believed it was his best role ever, his best acting role ever. Now, why is this important? Well, see the title there, Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet. Well, it turns out Paul Ehrlich was a German researcher and doctor who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1908. And most notably, it was because he developed a cure for syphilis. But there was really a lot more to it than that. He was pretty much the first thought leader in developing the ideas of antibiotics and chemotherapy and targeted medicine. Now that was a long time ago, and it was well ahead of those fields ever really being developed. So he was quite a luminary. And in fact, he coined the term magic bullet. That's the first person that actually mentioned the term magic bullet. And he defined it as a magic bullet as something that would hit its target without fail and with no collateral damage to the surrounding environment. He also talked about antibodies as being, in a way, magic bullets that identify their target themselves without harming the organism. Again, consider the time when this was happening. This was a really advanced set of ideas that guide everything that has happened in the fields of medicine, and as we'll talk about, in agriculture as well. And it impacted cancer therapies, and these are major turning points in modern oncology. And after 5,000 years of the only practice being surgical removal of tumors, there came on these four major turning points, one being radiotherapy, starting with X-rays. Later, it was chemotherapy. And then you can see there the targeted therapy that began at the beginning of the 1980s. And most recently, this idea of enabling our immune system to better operate in the fight against cancer. Just another way of depicting this, these are advances in lung cancer treatment, which have been tremendous just in the last 5 to 10 years. But you can see that, you know, from the 40s, there was chemotherapy all the way on up, which still goes on today, but along with targeted drugs and immunotherapy. This is a major change in how we view disease in humans. So what on earth does that have to do with cotton insect management? Well, I would say that it has a fair amount to do with it. Title of my talk is Trends in Cotton Insect Management and What's Next. And part of this is to say, where will our IPM plans be? How will we be facing insects? We think of us as a pyramid. I've tried to teach it as a multifaceted pyramid, and really a PCA or a grower has to consider not just the major pests, but all the array of minor pests, diseases, weeds, everything that could be impacting your grower's production. Now, if you didn't like that analogy, consider this. You know, in everyday life, in anything you think about, including pest management, would you rather have a sniper rifle or a shotgun blast? I suppose there are those times in history and places and situations where a shotgun blast is all we've got. But really, we want a sniper rifle that's going to hit the target right where we're aiming each time. And Paul Ehrlich was was really ahead of his time, and he made a statement like this: if a compound could be made which would selectively target an organism that is causing the disease, then an accompanying toxin for that organism could be delivered together with the agent of selectivity. So this idea of selectivity shows up over and over in his writings and his research, again, over 100 years ago. And today we define selectivity or selective toxicity as a chemical that produces injury to one kind of living matter without harming another form of life, even though the two may exist in intimate contact. And where is that more true than in cancers, where the cancer is actually inhabiting the human body and has actually taken over the human cell machinery? So obviously, the idea of selectivity in cancer therapy is a very powerful idea. And it's a very powerful idea in everything that we do in cotton pest management too. And it's really the promise of selectivity to all of medicine and to pest management generally that drives us forward in these innovations. And I pose the question here: are we really reaping the full investments by our growers and industry? Have we really maximized all the opportunities that have become available because we eradicated the boll weevil and the pink bollworm, because we have Cry1AC and other BT toxins that control our caterpillar pests, because we have all these new selective chemistries that control ligas and aphids and whiteflies, and because we will very shortly have a new trait, Thrive On, for control of ligas and thrips. Have we really reaped all the benefits of these investments in selectivity? And to answer that question, we can look at our history. And I've shown this a chart like this in most of my talks for many, many years now, and it just gets longer and longer and longer. It's now 30 years long here. And you can see the statewide foliar sprays that are made to cotton on average for the state of Arizona. And we can look at these important periods in time and recognize that we were not engaged in selective practices at all in the early 90s. We had exclusive use of broad spectrum insecticides, and we were spraying a great deal. Today, we're now all the way down, and we just finished this process with participating PCAs. We're down to a statewide average of 1.99 sprays, just under 2 sprays for a long season summer crop is put simply is astounding. It's really an amazing achievement of your industry to have moved from where we were 25 and 30 years ago to where we are today. And we've done that through successive improvements to the system, including the development and adoption of selective whitefly insect growth regulators, the use of selective BT cotton, the development and use of a selective ligas insecticide in carbine and later transform. But we have had hiccups in our history too, such as the brown stink bug outbreak that happened in starting in 2012, when we really didn't have a selective control. And it wasn't until we determined that there wasn't effective chemical controls that we could actually stop our investments in those broad spectrum controls and restore our stability. And most recently, we've been investing a lot of time teaching you about these new predator thresholds that we've introduced. So you can see this word selective is all over our history. And I guess it's important to recognize, well, how do we know something is selective? Well, the way you know it is by you test it. You test it in the ecology, in this case, the cotton agroecosystem, and you look at what happens to the arthropods in it as a result of the use of these insecticides. So we do invest in field testing these technologies routinely. We try to do it pre-commercial before these products reach the marketplace, so you already know whether you're placing those beneficials and pollinators at risk or not through the use of those technologies, and to determine whether they really are truly selective. And we've produced charts and put out publications. This is an excerpt from it where we document the selectivity of cotton insecticides. That includes all the things that are with low risk to beneficials, the stuff has moderate risk to beneficials, and the stuff that has high risk to beneficials. Now you may need these tools across the spectrum, but obviously anytime we can select a low risk or more selective approach, the better the outcomes might be. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because we've just reviewed the history. We see the history that, when we use exclusively broad spectrums, we were spraying a lot more, and things have gotten a lot better since then. But we can actually take the 1080 data that's generated by the state, by all the growers and the PCAs that make applications and submit those records to the state. We can take those data, look at the chemistry through the same history, and categorize each application as whether it was broad spectrum, partially selective, or fully selective. And this is what that chart ends up looking like. And not surprising, you have a sea of red over here where we were exclusively broad spectrum or non-selective, and we've progressively advanced to where there's more green in that chart. And there's a pattern of usage as well that shows through this period we're at 9 sprays on average, all the way down to our most recent period, which is now a little bit lower than this, 2.08 sprays. And then there's blips, right? There's blips in the intervening years. And this again is during that period when we so aggressively addressed brown stink bug control with broad spectrum chemistries. So let's just take out 1 year. Let's take out 2017 here and look at it as a pie chart. And this shows you that in Arizona cotton, we sprayed 2.2 times, and the majority of the time you're using fully selective materials. There are some broad spectrums and there are some partially selective materials in use as well. We can now look at our adjacent border state, California, and look at their 2017 record of use and see that they're averaging that year 9.5 sprays, nearly 5 times as much as us. And it should not go unnoticed that a large fraction of what they're spraying is broad spectrum, and a large fraction is also partially selective. Only the minority of materials are actually fully selective. So what's going on there? What's so different? Well, I'm not from California. I don't pretend to know all the context of what they have to grapple with, but I can look at the result. And the result is they use acetamiprid or intruder and assail, plus the other 4 neonicotinoids in great frequency. We use intruder and assail, but we don't use the other 4 neonicotinoids in cotton. They also use all these broad spectrums, most of which don't see any use in Arizona cotton whatsoever. There's about 15 or 16 compounds here that are in wide use in California cotton, and they are all broad spectrum, and with it, carry with it the risks of that broad spectrum approach. They are not reaping the benefits of the selective technologies available to them. We can also look more deeply at our data, and I did this a few years ago. I think I did it in preparation for the Desert Ag Conference, and I was thinking, well, if we believe all the things that we've learned about selectivity through history, through those that precede us, and through all these last 30 years, we should be able to ask questions about the current day, in this case, 2006 to 2016, a period in time after which carbine was available for control of ligas, a fully selective ligas insecticide. And we can ask, should there be a relationship between ligas sprays and sprays for secondary pests? Well, if we're not causing any collateral damage with our ligas sprays, then we really shouldn't be flaring any secondary pests. So I decided we should be able to chart that out, and we did. To my surprise, I found a positive relationship, meaning that there is a relationship between the number of ligas sprays made in cotton and the sprays made for secondary pests, going completely against my ideas about selectivity. And it really bothered me at first until I looked more deeply at the data and realized within that 11-year period, there were actually 3 years in which we used broad spectrums quite regularly. So I took those 3 years out, and suddenly the relationship went flat, meaning there was no positive relationship between ligas sprays and sprays for secondary pests. So that was affirming. It affirmed that selectivity is operating, and it also gave us a glimpse into what happens in those broad spectrum years, because there's a very strong and positive relationship. When we use broad spectrums for lygus control, we're going to see more secondary pest outbreaks and the need to spray more. So there is this period where selectivity became the norm. I'll call it the selective era since 1996. And now we can take all these years to the present day and examine trends and ask some basic questions. How does the use of non-selective sprays impact spray frequency? So as the proportion of our non-selective sprays increases, in other words, our increased dependence on broad spectrums, what would be the expected outcome? Well, based on everything we know, the more we spray those non-selective sprays, the more we're going to be spraying overall. A very positive and significant relationship using your data from this nearly 25-year period. Now that's what happens when we use, when we do this analysis, just looking at the broad spectrums. What if we reverse it and say, well, we really want to concentrate on the fully selective? Do we get the same relationship in inverse? And it's similar, but also quite telling. This is data from 2019, and it shows that as PCAs adopt fully selective materials at a greater frequency, the number of sprays actually declines. So there's a savings as more of their acreage, the acreage that they manage on behalf of growers, are sprayed with fully selective materials, the less frequently they have to be sprayed. So again, it shows us these are the benefits of these selective, very targeted approaches. So we talk about selectivity, we teach about it, we depict it in this red, yellow, green metaphor, where green is our fully selective materials, yellow are partially, and red are non-selective materials. But we also acknowledge there's other risks that have to be considered. And this chemical use guide provides a glimpse into those other risks, such as resistance, as well as risks to other non-target organisms. And those non-targets include aquatic environments, bees, and other pollinators. Of course, we're a non-target organism as well. We certainly don't want to be harming bystander humans, and we don't want to be impacting wildlife. So this very compact guide shows you all those risks in one table that your growers and PCAs should be looking at together when they plan for their 2021 season. Now, one thing missing from this is economic risk. Well, that's a moving target because prices and the cost of technologies change all the time. But one thing we can say is when we look at actual costs used to spray insecticides in cotton over time and adjust that for inflation, we know that we are spraying less money, let's say, or spending less money spraying insecticides today. And in fact, the last 10 of the last 15 years have been record lows over our history in Arizona cotton. So clearly this reinforces the selective approach as being a positive one to go to. And this analogy to medicine and oncology in particular is also interesting because of this latest innovation, which is really about removing inhibitors that inhibit our immune system so that we can supercharge our own immune system to do a lot of the fighting against cancer on its own. These are innovations that are occurring in cancer therapy, but there are also innovations that are happening right in your pest management system. Forever, we've asked you to count your pests. That's something that PCA does on behalf of their growers and customers. They go out and scout and they count the bad guys and they tell you when you've reached a threshold. Now we have new information to show that you can count these 6 key predators, any one or more of these 6 key predators, and understand whether biological control or the natural processes going on in your field are sufficient to keep whiteflies under control. We've delivered pocket guides and other publications for your use. We've distributed these over the last 2 years. I would say in order to reap the maximum benefits of selectivity, you need to consider using this. You as growers, you should want to see what are the beneficials doing in your field. And as a PCA, this is another thing you can help your growers to better understand when and where you can harness biological control and save an additional spray. So what's next? Well, what's next in the future of pest management is selective technologies. That's the name of the game. There are not broad spectrums being developed. Everything is very targeted, very selective. This is consistent with medicine. We're seeing it everywhere. And Thrive On technology is the latest technology by Bayer. It's a BT-based technology that targets Lygus hesperus or Lygus bugs, as well as Western flower thrips. We've been doing studies on them, on this technology for the last 12 years. We know it to be effective on Lygus and thrips. It was just deregulated last week. That means it can be grown in large formats. There are still restrictions imposed by the company, but you will see seed contracts this year, and there is full commercialization imminent. And we are still studying just which of these interactions are being driven when Thrive On is used to make sure there aren't any unintended non-target effects. We also have just published some work with Isadora Bordini, my student, has studied these 4 compounds and shown that they are fully selective, and they do reduce the key pests. They do conserve the key predators. They do support better predator-prey ratios. In other words, our predator thresholds. And together, this chemical control along with this biological control is giving us the kind of key pest control that we need. So we really have we owe a debt of gratitude to Paul Ehrlich and his forward thinking. He really set the stage for the promise of selectivity in the future. And that includes targeted therapies without collateral damage. That includes disabling any inhibitors of our natural defenses. And for us, that means use your fully selective insecticides, use the selective traits like BT, and maximize those ecosystem services like biological control by using predator thresholds and counting your key predators. So I hope you appreciate that we're a part of history. We're making history here, and there are a lot of advances that have been made in your industry, and we're stewarding a very progressive and beneficial production system.